I'm sitting here with Chris Bell, a candidate for governor. Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it, Adam.
So I just want to start off. Who is Chris Bell and why should he be the next governor of the great state of Texas?
Chris Bell is a lawyer and recovering politician, and I got out of the recovery program, just got back in the arena. But now I've served, I was very fortunate. I had not even lived in Houston in 10 years when I was elected to the city council there, and served on the city council, and then went on to be elected to Congress, and then became a victim of mid-decade redistricting, the first time they did it. And so came back home and ran for governor in 2006 and was the Democratic nominee, and have stayed in the mix, and certainly have watched things closely, but have concentrated more on my law practice in recent years. And I've watched what was going on in the state and said, I think my experience would be very useful. So got back in.
Speaking of which, I wanted to touch on that. 20 years ago, you ran for this seat. You won the nomination and eventually fell to then Governor Rick Perry. What did you learn from that race, and why did you feel like 2 decades later, now is the time to hop back in?
Well, it's a fascinating race in that it's the closest anyone has come on the Democratic side since Ann Richards was governor. And it was sort of a fascinating time for the Democratic Party that we were at a real low point, and I wanted to stay in the fight, and so came back home and ran. And it was probably the most fascinating race I've ever been in, because the state is so vast and so diverse, and in different geographic areas, the differences are so stark, and to be able to learn that and see that and make friends all over the state, it was an incredible experience. It was very, very different. And I tell this story sometimes. I went to a friend who had always been a backer, and he was sort of on the fence, or wasn't a whole lot of confidence about whether a Democrat could win. And he said, Chris, you know, my feeling is that whoever's elected, the trains are going to run pretty much on time. And at the time, Adam, I couldn't really disagree with him that much, because that's the way things had always been. Well, now the trains aren't running on time. They're not even coming close to running on time. And so that mentality has changed completely, and people see that this is a real battle for the future of the state. And I don't think it felt quite that intense 20 years ago.
Well, speaking of a battle for the future of the state, what would some of those first 100-day policies be from you should you be elected?
Well, my major focus is going to be education, and I don't think it's just about putting more money into education. That's one piece of the puzzle, but it's also how are we going to spend that money. And I think we have tremendous opportunities right now because of the advancements that we've seen with artificial intelligence, and what certain private schools have been doing that with artificial intelligence, but also what public schools have been doing. And I think instead of just being fearful of it, and obviously there are some things with AI that we need to be worried about, but we need to be taking advantage of what it can improve. And I think it can really help change and improve public school education. And I don't see it in any way, shape, or form as a replacement for teachers. I think we're always going to need teachers. What I see it as is a way to allow teachers to do what they do best, and that is teach. And so what I would really like to focus on very early on are model schools set up in different parts of the state to see how it works, and to introduce AI at a much larger scale and see if it's something that can be spread to the rest of the state. So that will certainly be a major focus. First 100 days, I'm going to be talking about campaign finance reform, the corruption that is eating our state from the inside out, mainly is driven by the fact that we place no limits on the amount of money people can contribute to statewide campaigns. And that is absolutely absurd. And think people in Texas are waking up to that and know we need to do something about it. But if they want to do something about it, they should hire someone who's been in that fight for a very long time. I chaired the ethics committee when I was a member of the Houston City Council. We passed some of the most sweeping reforms that had been seen there in years. Went to Congress, saw a very corrupt fellow member who was Tom DeLay, and one of the most powerful people in America at that time. And there had been a so-called truce placed on the filing of ethics complaints in Congress. And I thought that was absurd, it was unwritten, it wasn't a real rule. And they said he needs to be called on the carpet. So I filed that. People were shocked. A lot of folks in the media said that'll go nowhere. Well, he was unanimously admonished, and it became really the first chink in his armor in terms of bringing him down. So if people want a fighter and someone who believes very strongly in an ethical government, I think I'll be their candidate.
Speaking of fighting, should you win the nomination, barring unforeseen events, your candidate that you'd be running up against is longtime Governor Greg Abbott, someone who, in this state, from an outsider's perspective, feels untouchable. How do you approach a campaign like that to try to overtake the political machine that is Greg Abbott?
Well, people say that because they don't look at his approval rating. And I don't see how anyone can say that they're invulnerable when they only have a 39% approval rating. And it's his lowest point in his entire governorship. And I think that's because people are noticing. They're upset about private school vouchers. They're upset about mid-decade redistricting that nobody asked for. They're upset about sending the National Guard off to foreign lands like Chicago. But it's things that just make absolutely no sense. And I think they're very concerned about his too close association with Donald Trump. And I often joke that we have a governor who spends 50% of his time thinking about being president and the other 50% sucking up to one. And I'm not going to be that type of governor. And of course you talk about the money, and money's important in politics. Nobody is going to say that it's not. But what do we use money for in politics? We use it to get our name out, to advertise ourselves. Well, Greg Abbott's problem is not that people don't know who he is, it's that they do know who he is. Everybody knows who he is, and they don't like what he's doing. And so I think this is going to be a wave election for the Democratic Party. I think it's the best opportunity that we've had in a very long time. And like I like to say, timing is everything.
And to get to that general election, you'd have to win what's looking like a very contested primary. You have candidates like yourself, State Representative Gina Hinojosa, you have business manager Wright, you have Bobby Cole, all with very unique backgrounds and perspectives. How do you elevate yourself above the field to try to win this nomination?
Well, I think if people are worried about experience, and they usually are, especially when you're talking about a position like governor, that my experience in government, my record in government, not someone who's just out there talking about what I'm going to do, but people can look at what I've done. And I think they can have a lot of confidence that I'll lead the state in the right direction. And it's good to have some residual name ID. It's good to run statewide before and establish friendships in a lot of different places. And I think that is going to be an added advantage as well. But I think if people really look at the ballot and think about who's going to be in the best position on day one to take the reins of the governor's office and start moving Texas in a more positive direction, I think I'll be their choice.
So even if a Democrat were to unseat Abbott and win the governorship, there would still be a high likelihood the state legislature is either very divided or still leaning Republican. How would you work under that environment?
Well, I think very well, because that's sort of always been part of my political makeup, to be able to get along with the other side and to work and find ways that we can compromise and perhaps move to the middle and find something that we can all live with. And we need to be doing a lot more of that here in the state of Texas. And it's kind of funny, because I think I might have a different view of the way something ought to work, but with some fine tuning and with some movement from the right and some movement from the left, we can get there. And I believe that most Republicans and Democrats are concerned about the major issues. I don't think corruption is just a Democratic issue. I think a lot of Republicans are probably somewhat horrified by what they're seeing. Education, we've made somewhat of a partisan issue in this state, but that's ridiculous. It's not good for the people of Texas. And so I'll certainly be mindful of the fact that I may be working with a majority Republican legislature, and you have to pick your battles when you're in that situation. But I'm pretty good at picking.
To wrap up here, I'm just going to ask you two of my go-to questions. First one I ask to every Democratic candidate who comes into this studio. There's a lot of talk in the national media about Texas politics, redistricting, now with our very contentious Senate primary going on. What do you think is the one thing that national media doesn't get about Texas?
Well, they paint it as an extraordinarily red state because of the elections over the last 34 years. And I get that, but they don't look at any of the changes that are going on. And they only focus on money, and they don't really focus on what may be happening at the grassroots level. There is an anger out there right now about what is going on, and I see it in rural areas like where I live. I see it in the big cities like where I used to live. And it's not just anger, Adam, it's also fear. And people are worried that we're not going to be the state that we bragged about for so long unless we start making some changes. And I think that's been completely missed. And that's why I'm back in the arena, because I want to start making some of those positive changes and work very hard to do so.
A final question I ask to everybody is, I want to peel back the layer of the politician and get to the person. What does Chris Bell like to do in his free time?
I like to play pool. I have a pool table, and I love to play pool. I love to swim, and I'm fortunate enough to have a swimming pool. I love to read, and so I spend as much as time when I'm not reading about things for this campaign, reading books, and that's, and I love to play golf. Not as much as Donald Trump, but I do love to play golf. I just don't get out there quite as often.
Well, any last words? The last word is yours.
Well, it is an important election, and every cycle, this is the most important election. And I'm not going to say that, but it is a damn important election. We're at a critical time here in the state of Texas, and it worries me because the other main motivating force for me was that I really do believe that Greg Abbott and others have basically declared war on public school education. And public schools have been the keys to so many futures for Texans, and we have to get away from that mindset and start doing what we need to do to make sure that when kids graduate high school, they're one of two things, either ready to go to college or ready to go to work. And I assure you that's my number one goal.
Well, former Congressman Chris Bell, thank you so much for taking the time. Good luck.
Thank you, and thanks for having me.